Alright, today I'm going to document as I go through an attempt to change the front rotor on a 1999 Isuzu Amigo. Rotor replacements in general are pretty easy, and I expected this to be pretty easy too, but I found out that the Amigo on the front has what's called a captive rotor. The backs are not captive, but the front are, and if you've never done a captive rotor replacement, you won't realize, but it's quite a job, probably 4 times the job that a regular rotor replacement might be. I did the left front yesterday. I took into it thinking it was a 30 to 45 minute job and found out that it's more like a 3 to 4 hour job. But I've learned some things. First of all, I've learned what a captive rotor is. Just to briefly explain the difference, you know you have a captive rotor if, first of all, I've supported the car on jack stands. Never trust a hydraulic jack while you're working under a car. And I've taken the wheel off. That's all I've done. When you take the wheel off, you'll know that the rotor is captive if this hub assembly is outside of the rotor. If you can see this hub and you don't see the face of the rotor right here, then you know you've got a captive rotor. To get this off of here, you pull the caliper and the caliper, I guess, support bracket. I'm not sure what that's called, but you pull that off just like normal. But you have to pull this whole hub off. And the first part of doing that is pulling this inner cap off, and then there's some gears in there that'll show you. You have to unscrew, and then the hub and the rotor come off together, and then you got to get those two things apart, which is sometimes the most difficult part of the job. So I'm going to tear into this and update as I go. Okay, at this point I've taken just this cap off. There's 6 hex nuts there. Took that off, set it aside. Now there's a snap ring that sits, basically holds this spacer onto the axle hub. You got a pair of snap ring pliers that makes this job a lot easier. You can do it with a screwdriver, but snap ring pliers makes that job really easy. Just comes right off. Set that over in the hub, and this just slides off. I think it's just a spacer. I'm just taking a look inside here for the first time to see a lot of grease. I mean, this is where the axle bearings are packed with grease, so this is just kind of messy in here. So the next part will be to clean this up a little bit, show you what's under all the grease, and the next step. This little washer just kind of pries off here. See if I can get that off. There it goes. Pops off just like that. Clean it up just a little bit, set it aside. The next thing that has to happen is this little washer, and you can see it's already turning. You need to just back that out, and there's little holes in here. Don't use the holes that the 3 screws were screwed into. There's 2 other holes. I'm assuming there's some tool you can put on there, but these, one on the other side and this one were, it's like both loose enough to just use these holes with the screwdriver, and they just okay, so that part backed out pretty nicely. I just cleaned it up a little bit and set it aside. The next step, I think this stuff inside the hub is essentially ready to pull out at this point, and it would do that, but now we just have to take off the caliper and get it. It's just kind of like a normal brake job. I'm going to kind of not really show all that. The caliper is held on by 2 bolts that sit here and behind here. Those come out, and then you can take the caliper and get it out of the way. And then this bracket, there's 2 more bolts back behind to hold that bracket on. So I'm going to take that off, and then we'll go about the process of pulling this hub and the rotor assembly out. Okay, I've gotten the brake caliper off, and it's up here, suspended from a wire. Don't hang those from the brake line, or you're just asking for trouble. and I got the brake pad shoe off and set aside. Now this whole thing, as I got that brake shoe and caliper off, it just loosened right up and it just pulls right off. I don't know on yours. There might be some difficulty getting off, but the other one just jumped right off, and this one just jumped right off too. So this is the animal you're dealing with. Inside are the bearings, and the chore now is to separate the hub from, and there goes the bearing right there. The chore now is to separate the hub from the rotor, but the biggest problem I had on the last one was separating this little inner collar. I don't even know what this inner collar is for, but it's got 3 of these little hex screws that attach it to the rotor. You can see this rotor is just trash. But I had to drill 2 of those screws out because they were in there so badly. So hopefully this one goes a little smoother. Okay, first part of separating these 2 was to remove these 6 bolts. I think these are the primary thing that keeps the hub on the rotor, so I've loosened those all up, and those should just be pulling out here. Thought I had them all loose. The next step, I think, is to beat on this thing for a while. When I did the other one, I just kind of tapped on the hub a little bit. You know, I'm going to be replacing the rotor, so I'm not too concerned about messing up the rotor, but you know, don't get too aggressive and be patient with it. The other one came out. Okay, it definitely was not an easy chore separating this hub from the old rotor. It was by far the hardest part of this job so far, getting this hub off. The rotor set right here. It's over on the workbench. Definitely took some doing. I did hammer on the inside of this rotor, but in the end, one of the tricks that you can do is insert a bolt. I wouldn't necessarily use the bolts that came in it, but you could insert a bolt upside down like this through here, thread that bolt into the rotor, and then tap on the head bolt of the bolt there, and that seemed to help. But still, patience is the name of the game. Don't get frustrated. It'll come off eventually. But that's the old one. The next step is to get the new one, which is in that box right there, and press it down like this over the hub, making sure that you align the bolt holes. I did clean this this part here that goes inside the rotor. I brushed it off real good, cleaned it off real good. I'm going to put a layer of grease on it. Just this old grease from inside here will work just fine. I'm going to be repacking all this grease inside while you're in here. You should do that. That's probably too much grease on that. Just so things go together a little easier, and get that pressed down on there. The other one that I did on the other side yesterday, it's a far easier job getting these 2 things separated. So this was a little bit harder, but we'll press on. Okay. Well, as it turns out, this thing just slid right down over the hub. It's not seized, it's not locked on there whatsoever. So it's easy enough to just slide it on. Line up those holes, and then put the bolts on. The bolts will go in the backside. Ouch. What I didn't show is these new rotors come with a kind of an oily film on them in the box when you get them from the store. If you don't clean that off really good, it'll smoke when you first start it, or when you first use the brakes. So I did shoot that around with brake fluid. So I'm going to get this bolted up and continue on. Okay, I got all the bolts fastened on. The hub is now attached to the brake caliper. The next step is I'm going to clean out a lot of this grease that's in here, get the bearing put back in there, and repack that with good quality grease. Okay, the bearing is packed with good quality grease. The next step is to just take this whole assembly and lift it onto the axle. Really, should take care because this outer bearing is just in there loose. It's basically only held on there with the grease. So when you lift it up there, you can kind of see I just packed the grease in to hold that bearing in, and we'll just slide it over, that whole assembly over the axle. You can see that bearing wants to come out there. Push it back in, and basically that's back on now. The next step is to grab this ring we took off previously that holds the bearing in, basically. Make sure you get it the right way out. Set it on there and thread it in. I'm going to try and thread that. Start that by hand. As I mentioned when I took this off, I'm sure there's a tool that you can use to thread that on and off, but it really is easy. It goes easy if you can get it threaded right. It goes on there and out of there easy, so I didn't have any problem just using the screwdriver. Struggling with it a little bit, but I'll get it eventually, and then after that goes on, then this little retainer washer goes on that. Those 3 little screws go back on. Then the lock ring, and then that cap goes on the top of that. Then you're actually ready to just do a brake job. So I'm going to get those 3 things put back together and step through the brake job. Okay, the rotor and hub assembly is on. Pretty new rotor with a nice shiny surface. Turns freely, as you can see. So the only thing left is to do just a typical brake job on the thing. Replace the brake pads. This assembly just kind of lifted off. This thing sits just like this. 2 big bolts keep it on in the back. Those bolts keep that assembly on, and it houses the brake shoes. The brake shoes are kept in this with just these kind of little wiry brackets. They're easily bent, so kind of be a little bit tender taking them out. This obviously you're going to reuse, this you're going to throw away, so I like to kind of clean this up a little bit. An important part of a brake job is brake grease. They sell this at the auto parts store up by the counter. If you don't use brake grease, you run the risk of your brand new brake pads squeaking, and that'll drive you nuts. It's bad enough that the old ones squeak and drive you nuts, but then you get a brake job and the new ones will squeak too. What'll squeak is sometimes these surfaces in here when you apply the brake. Sometimes it's the surface between the cylinder piston and the back of the brake shoe. So you want to grease all those surfaces. Don't obviously apply grease to the friction surface or the rotor. So here's the old pads. They actually have a lot of life left in them. The reason I'm doing this project is that primarily because the rotors need to be replaced. At high speeds, anything over about 50 miles an hour, if you got on the brakes any at all, the car would shake side to side. You'd feel it in the steering wheel, and that's an indication that the rotors are warped. And you saw that old rotor, you couldn't see evidently that it was warped, but you could definitely see it was pitted and needed to be replaced. So I'm going to go ahead and replace the brake shoes with new ones. The new ones here. I'll just pull them out. These aren't them. These are the rear pads. Front pads are up on the workbench. But I'll replace the pads, get that all back on, and just about done here. Alright, new pads are on, the caliper is back on, that bracket, got that put back on. So that's it. All that's left is to put the tire back on and take it for a spin.